Hey everybody, Jonathan here coming to you from Blue HQ, and today we're going to do part 3 in our multi-part series about rebreathers. Now if you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, you should watch those first. So the first part we talked about what is a rebreather, and in the second part we talked about what are the advantages and disadvantages of rebreathers, sort of in general, you know. And now in this third part, we're going to look at the two different major types of rebreathers. On the one hand, you have the semi-closed rebreather, and on the other hand, the fully closed rebreather. Now, semi-closed rebreather is often abbreviated SCR, just like you would think semi-closed rebreather. Fully closed rebreather, you would think that it would be FCR, but in fact, it is CCR. No, not that CCR. That's the rock band from the 60s. CCR, closed circuit rebreather. Now, within CCRs, there's different types. And within semi-closed rebreathers, there's different types. And we're not really going to delve really too deeply into that today. We're just going to talk about the differences between these two types of rebreathers. So I'm going to start by explaining the simpler one, and then that will lead into explaining the slightly more complicated one. So the simpler is the semi-closed rebreather. And the best way to explain a semi-closed rebreather is with a little example. But before I do the example, a semi-closed rebreather operates on a single gas, which means that the rebreather has one tank, one cylinder of gas connected to it, and it only needs that one tank to run. So it's simpler. But in order for that to work, it has some limitations in how it functions. So let's do a demonstration. So our semi-closed rebreather would operate on a single cylinder of nitrox. Probably a cylinder smaller than this one, actually. This is just what I happen to have at the office, okay? So imagine that this is a complete rebreather, okay? This is the counter lung, but it also goes through a scrubber to take out the CO2, and it also goes around into a hose in my mouth with one-way valves so that the gas can go around. But let's talk about the basics of how a semi-closed is going to work. So what you're going to do first is you're going to put nitrox in the counter lung, okay? And now we're breathing from our rebreather. Now let's review what's happening when we're rebreathing from this incredible rebreather that we just built. I am going to be metabolizing the oxygen that's in the counter lung as I breathe it in and out. My body is going to make carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is going to go into the rebreather, but it's going to get passed through a scrubber canister, which is going to absorb, it's going to chemically bind the carbon dioxide so that it's no longer being circulated because it's poison. And then the question is, how do you replenish the oxygen that was used? Okay? Keeping in mind that there's also nitrogen moving around in there. Okay? That nitrogen is moving around too. But we want to replenish the oxygen, but we don't need any extra nitrogen. So how are you going to do that? Okay. For this, I'm going to need to use my whiteboard. Okay, so let's just say that that single tank contains 36% nitrox, okay? And that means, of course, if you've seen our nitrox video, that it's 36% oxygen and the rest is nitrogen. So it's got slightly more oxygen than air. Which only has 21% oxygen. And I'm going to come back to why this is important, okay? So we're going to put 36% nitrox in that rebreather. We're going to fill it up with 36% nitrox, okay? And so I'm going to make a little graph. So this is time, okay? And this one is O2%, all right? So we're going to start off at 36% O2. And what's going to happen is we're going to fill it up there, and then we're going to breathe, and we're going to breathe, and we're going to breathe. And what's going to happen is the O2 that's in that counter lung, that's in that rebreather, is going to start to fall. Now remember, we're not talking about what's happening with the CO2, because that's just getting absorbed by the the scrubber. So we're not even gonna think about that. We're just gonna assume the scrubber is doing its job, okay? We're only concerned right now with the oxygen. We're not gonna pay attention to the nitrogen, the CO2, all right? So the O2 is going down, it's going down, it's going down. Well, at some point, it's gonna get to a level that's kind of lower, and we don't really want it to be that low. So once the oxygen level gets a little too low, what we're gonna do is get all of the gas out of the rebreather, and we're gonna refill it with fresh nitrox. And back to breathing. And then when the oxygen gets low again, we're gonna empty the whole rebreather out, and we're gonna fill it up again. Now, let's take a look on the graph at what's happening here. So, in this hypothetical rebreather setup, as the oxygen goes down, it's gonna hit a point, then we're gonna get rid of all the gas in the rebreather, and we're gonna fill it back up. And then time is gonna go by and the oxygen's gonna go down, and then when it gets low enough, we're gonna dump it all out, and we're gonna fill it back up. And this is gonna go on like this. Now this isn't actually technically how a semi-closed works. I'm explaining a concept, so bear with me. So this is what we're gonna see. We're gonna see that our oxygen does like a sawtooth pattern. And let's just say that when it gets down to 28%, that's when we fill it back up with fresh gas. What you're gonna see is that on the average over time, your body is gonna be sitting at an average O2 of around, say, 32%. What's happening here is if we were to run a semi-closed rebreather in this way, we would end up with an average oxygen level of somewhere between the mixture that's in the tank and some arbitrary mixture that we consider too low to be happy. You'll see this is why a semi-closed rebreather doesn't use air, because the top number would only be 21 and it would go down from there, and we definitely don't want to be breathing less oxygen than there is in air. So we always want to start with a mixture that has a lot more oxygen than air does, okay? So this is the basic concept of a semi-closed rebreather, which is that you're constantly replenishing the gas because you're breathing down the oxygen and you don't have any way to replace just the oxygen. So you have to replace everything. And the way it generally really works with the semi-closed, it doesn't work like you breathe it for a while, then you vent it, you refill it, and you breathe it for a while and you vent it and you refill it. What actually happens is the refilling and the venting is always happening at the same time. So the way most semi-closed rebreathers work is you actually have an orifice hooked up to your scuba tank that's just constantly putting in a little bit of gas. Sort of like, I'm gonna bring this tank back over. It's kind of like, it's doing this. The rebreather is always putting a little bit of gas into the counter lung for you to breathe. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the counter lung fills up and eventually it's completely full, and so you're breathing from a completely full counter lung. Well, now what? Well, there's a little burp valve on the rebreather back behind your head that every time you exhale and you fill up that counter lung and it gets very full, the little burp valve is gonna go, it's gonna let a little bit of gas out. And so there's constantly gas going into the rebreather, and then every time you exhale, a little bit comes out. And what it means is not a whole breath comes out. Okay, so what's happening with a semi-closed rebreather is you're still making bubbles, but you're making much fewer bubbles because only a fraction of a breath comes out each time. So most of these rebreathers have somewhere between 6-to-1 and 10-to-1 efficiency, all right? And what that means in a 6-to-1 efficiency, that means that for every 6 times you breathe, 1 breath comes out the top, the equivalent of 1 breath. What it really means is every time you breathe, every time you exhale, 1/6 of your exhaled volume of gas burps out the top of the rebreather. And what does this mean? It means that your gas lasts 6 times as long as it would on open circuit. So if you have a SCUBA tank on the back of your semi-closed rebreather that's, say, a 50 cubic foot bottle, and let's say that that would run you, I don't know, 45 minutes on a dive if it was open circuit. On the rebreather, it'll run you 6 times as long. 45 minutes. Times 6 is 270 minutes divided by 60, so 4.5 hours. Okay, so that's pretty good. What's the advantage of a semi-closed rebreather? They are super simple, they are super reliable, they give you pretty good gas efficiency, much better than open circuit, and minimal bubbles. However, they do still make some bubbles. They don't make that many bubbles, so for most things like marine life and stuff, they make so much less bubbles than open circuit that they give you a lot of good filming opportunities with marine life. And they extend your gas quite a bit. What are the disadvantages though? The disadvantage is that you don't really have a lot of control over your breathing mixture. The only thing you can pick is which orifice do you choose, because sometimes there's multiple orifices, and which gas do you start with? And then what's going to happen on the dive, what you're actually breathing, it's kind of, a combination of factors. What's the gas you started with? What's the orifice flowing? And more importantly, what is your metabolic rate? And that means that 2 different people on the same rebreather with the same orifice with the same gas will be breathing a different percentage of oxygen. Because if one person is a bigger person and they use more oxygen, then this is going to go lower and you're going to have a lower overall amount of oxygen. Whereas if someone is just chilling out, sitting on the bottom, not doing anything, they're relaxing, they're waiting for a fish to do something, they're not metabolizing much oxygen, their O2 percentage that they're breathing is going to be higher, and you don't really have any control over that. So that's one kind of major disadvantage. And the other thing is that it's not totally predictable what it's going to be, because one minute you might be resting on the bottom, and the next minute you're swimming after some sharks, and your metabolic rate completely changes. And what that does is it causes the O2 level in the rebreather to fluctuate as a function of your workload. There are rebreathers, there are semi-closed rebreathers that are designed with a little bit more complicated internals to feed you more gas when you're breathing faster and less when you're breathing less fast. So there's one design that every time you exhale, it vents gas only directly, a portion of your gas directly from the breathing loop. And in that way, if you don't breathe as much, you don't vent as much. Whereas with a constant flow semi-closed rebreather, even if you were to hold your breath, that orifice is, it's always going. Even if I hold my breath, it's still filling the rebreather up with nitrox, and eventually it's going to start burping out no matter how little I breathe or how relaxed I am. So if you have a semi-closed rebreather that only puts the gas in when you breathe like this, it's even more efficient, and those are the ones that go 10-to-1. All right, so, but they have to put in quite a bit more gas than you're breathing, just so that you can constantly be flushing out the mixture and keep the oxygen level up. So that is the semi-closed rebreather. Another great advantage of a semi-closed is it only uses one gas. It uses nitrox, and you can get nitrox virtually anywhere. And it's simpler to handle because it only has that one bottle on it. And it's completely mechanical. It doesn't require any electronics, no batteries, no computers. You are still going to want to have an oxygen sensor in it so that your computer knows what you're breathing and your computer can calculate your decompression. So it's not completely without electronics, but you're always going to have a dive computer anyway. So that's not really a big deal. So now we're going to talk about the other major type of rebreather, the fully closed rebreather. Now, a fully closed rebreather, or as we like to call them, a CCR, a closed circuit rebreather. It's a little bit more complicated than a semi-closed, but it has a lot of advantages. Now, how do we think of it as being different? A fully closed rebreather doesn't use one gas. It uses two gases, so you have to carry two separate tanks. You will have a tank of pure oxygen, and you will have a tank of what we call a diluent. Now, what is a diluent? If you're going to be blending the ideal breathing gas inside your rebreather, obviously you have to have a tank of pure oxygen so that you can actually control the oxygen level independently of the nitrogen or whatever else is in your rebreather. Most of the time it would just be nitrogen, okay? Because that's what air is, oxygen and nitrogen. If you're diving really deep, there might be some helium involved, but that's the advanced class. We're not going to talk about that yet. We're just going to assume it's nitrogen. So if we're standing here in Blue HQ, and I'm breathing air, I got 21% oxygen and 79% nitrogen, and that's mostly what I'm breathing. There's tiny fractional amounts of other gases in there, but not enough to worry about, okay? So that's what we got. And when we get to nitrox, we crank up the oxygen a little higher. Of course, if you've seen our nitrox video, then you know why we do that. It's not because we need more oxygen. We got plenty of oxygen. It's because we want less nitrogen. So if we displace some of it with some oxygen, that's good. But you can't displace it with too much oxygen because too much oxygen is bad. So there's a happy range of oxygen, okay? And in our rebreather, what we would love to do is have the best possible oxygen percentage for whatever depth we're at, right? The deeper you go, the less oxygen your body can tolerate. But if we want to have the minimal amount of decompression, we want to minimize the amount of nitrogen we have at any depth. So our bodies can stand to have pure oxygen down to 20 feet. So when I'm on my rebreather and I'm at 20 feet, I want to crank the O2 as high as it can go, 100%, because I get no nitrogen, so I can off-gas really quickly if it's at the beginning of the dive or at the end of the dive. And if it's the beginning of the dive, it doesn't really matter, right? But then if I go down to 100 feet, now at 100 feet, I cannot breathe pure oxygen. You will have a convulsion and you will die. That's very bad. But I can have quite a bit more oxygen at 100 feet in my mix than I have in air. I can have like 36% oxygen down at 100 feet, and that's okay. And as I go deeper than that, the oxygen percentage has to go lower and lower in order to be safe. But what you can do when you can independently control the amount of oxygen in your rebreather, unlike a semi-closed rebreather, you have the ideal blend for whatever depth you're at. And why is that important? That gives you less decompression time and longer dives. Bottom line. Of course, a fully closed rebreather also doesn't make bubbles at all, unless you change depth and you have to burp some out because you're going up and the pressure goes down as you go up and your counter lung expands and a little bit of air has to burp out. So other than that, you don't make any bubbles. So the fully closed, when you separate the oxygen and the nitrogen into separate containers and then you control them independently, you have a better gas blender that can do more things. So that's why everybody loves fully closed rebreathers. Now, you might be asking, what's in the other tank? We know this. Where's my little... So this is an oxygen bottle from my rebreather. It's a 2-liter bottle. And this thing will hold 6 hours of oxygen. You don't actually metabolize all that much oxygen. If you're just feeding yourself the oxygen that you need, this thing will last a long time. So that's another really nice thing about fully closed rebreathers, is that you can have this tiny little bottle of oxygen and it can last me 6 hours. But what's in the other tank? You might be thinking, nitrogen, right? You're going to put nitrogen in the other tank so that you have nitrogen and oxygen and you can blend your own nitrox. No. Why not? Well, first of all, it's a pain to get nitrogen, and air is 79% nitrogen, and it's all around us and it's much easier to get. So in the other tank, we put air most of the time, sometimes other things, but for now, air. It's mostly nitrogen. It does have some oxygen in it, but when you mostly just need to put some nitrogen in your mix, you get mostly nitrogen out of the other tank. And we call that other tank diluent. Diluent because it is used to dilute the oxygen. You can't be breathing pure oxygen. You need to dilute it with something, so we call the other tank diluent is what you would want to say, but it's actually diluent is how we say it, okay? So the other tank is basically just air. And what do you use that mostly for? Because let's think about this for a second. You're on a dive, you're swimming along. Your body's metabolizing the oxygen that's in the mix, okay? And turning it into CO2. The CO2 is coming out of your lungs, it's going into the loop, you're breathing it around, it goes through the scrubber, and the CO2 gets removed by the scrubber, and the oxygen goes down. And then what happens? You're going to look at your computer and you're going to say, oh, my oxygen is going down. Now in the semi-closed, you'd have to burp out some air, right? And refresh it with fresh air. But with this type of a system, we just put some more oxygen in, tiny little bit, bring the oxygen level back up to where it wants to be, and we just keep going. And we never have to touch the diluent. We never have to put more nitrogen in until... what happens? Well, until you decide to go deeper. And what happens when you go deeper? There's more pressure, and it squeezes in on your lungs, and it squeezes in on your counter lung, and it squishes the volume of everything down. And now you're going to take a breath and you can't breathe because there isn't enough gas in the unit because it got squished down by the pressure. So that's when you go and you put some diluent in. You're filling up some volume. You don't want to put in pure oxygen because you're too deep for that. That's bad. It'll be toxic. You might put in a tiny bit of oxygen, but then to fill up that volume, just put in some air, diluent. Okay? And so with a fully closed rebreather, you control these two things independently. And that allows you to get the ultimate mix for any depth. And it also means that the only time you really use any of your diluent is when you go deeper. And then when you're coming up, the thing's expanding and you're burping out stuff, but you're not putting it in. And so on a typical dive, I might use a third of my oxygen bottle for like 2 hours. I'll use like a third of it. It'll go from like 3,000 PSI to 2,000 PSI. And in my diluent, I probably only use 100 PSI of it. I hardly use any because it's just like a little bit now and then to fill up the counter lung. But here is another incredibly good reason why for our diluent we use air and we don't use nitrogen. And the reason is because if you were to breathe nitrogen, if you were to bail out of your rebreather, you have a problem with your rebreather, you take the mouthpiece out and you're going to switch to your normal SCUBA regulator. Isn't it nice to have a breathable gas, not a non-breathable gas? Yeah, because you can't breathe nitrogen. I mean, you can for about 30 seconds and then you pass out and die. So that's bad. So you want to have something you can breathe. So if you carry air as your diluent, it's also a breathable gas. So if you need to bail out of your rebreather at 100 feet, you can't bail out to pure oxygen, that's bad, but you can bail out to air. So you can use that tank of diluent as a bailout. Now, in many rebreathers, that tank of diluent is only this big. It's not really enough to bail out. And so you'll notice that most rebreather divers, in addition to their diluent, they carry another tank that's a bailout. So they actually have two bailouts. They have the diluent bailout and they have another bailout. And then they have the oxygen. And if you can get to the oxygen open circuit, then you could go up to 20 feet to your deco stop and you could potentially switch to the oxygen without going back on the rebreather if your rebreather is set up that way. Some people it is and some people it isn't. One of the things that I really like about the KISS Sidewinder is because it's a side mount rebreather and it's designed to have 2 cylinders, 1 on each side. I have 2 equally sized cylinders that are bailout. One of them is my diluent and the other one is my bailout, and because they're the same size and they're side mounted, they balance and I'm all streamlined and balanced, whereas a lot of rebreathers, what they do is they put one tank on the back that's O2, the other tank on the back that's diluent, so they're on your back, and then they still need one more bailout. So it's like, what do I do with this bailout? And then they sling it on one side, or they put it across the chest, or they sling it on the other side, and it's not balanced. And so in the case of the Sidewinder, because it's set up already for the whole side mount thing, you have this little tiny O2 tank on your butt, and then the side mounts give you your diluent and your bailout on both sides. Now, this is a very tiny, brief look at rebreathers because we're just looking at semi-closed versus CCR fully closed. Within the CCR world, there are as many designs as there are fish in the sea. There are so many different designs of how they can work. You've got the manual CCR and the electronic CCR, and within those 2 types, there's all kinds of variations. So that'll be the subject of another video. So this video, just talking about the difference between the semi-closed and the fully closed. And I hope that that all made sense. If it didn't, leave a question in the comments. I will try to answer it if it's not above my pay grade. And if it is, I'll just get Todd to answer it. So that's all I got for today. Thank you for joining us here at Blue HQ. And I'll see you next time on SCUBA 101.
Hey everyone! Thanks for watching our latest episode all the way to the end. Hit that subscribe button now so you won't miss our next episode.